Well, hey there. Thank you so much for joining us today. Mm-hmm. Hey, no matter where you're joining us from, we would so appreciate your feedback. So if you're on Spotify or you're over on Apple Podcasts, would you just scroll down and give us the star rating that you think best represents the quality of the show? And if you happen to be on Apple Podcasts and you got a little bit of extra time, we would love to hear your review of the show as well. What have you been learning? What has made a difference for you? And how can we continue to support you?
Absolutely.
So, take a moment to do that. Hey, I don't always share a whole lot about my family of origin, but some of you might know that I actually grew up in a blended family. The reason for that was that my mom passed away when I was about a year old. And there was a lot of grief that came along that journey, even though I didn't actually have any memory of my mom. And that's one of the reasons that I am really looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have today.
Mm-hmm. Grief is such an important topic because every blended family is born out of loss.
Right.
And with that comes grief. And honey, yours was due to a death. Our blend was due to divorce.
Right.
And so no matter what your dynamics are, the specifics around your blend, this episode is for you. This is such an important topic.
And it's one of the reasons that I'm so looking forward to Krista St. Germain joining us. Now, Krista is a master certified life coach, post-traumatic growth and grief expert. She's a widow, a mom, and the host of the Widowed Mom podcast. When her husband was killed by a drunk driver in 2016, Krista's life was completely and unexpectedly flipped upside down. After therapy helped her to uncurl from the fetal position, Krista discovered life coaching, post-traumatic growth, and learned the tools that she needed to move forward and create a future she could get excited about. Now she coaches and teaches other widows so they can love life again too. Krista's been featured online and in print in Psychology Today, Medium, Thrive Global, Bustle, Psych Central, and Parents Magazine, and on many other podcasts such as the Self-Work Podcast, Seek the Joy, Life Check Yourself, and You Need a Budget, to name a few. And now she's here on Blended Family Breakthrough as well. So we're going to talk to Krista just on the other side of the intro, and we'll meet you there. Welcome to the Blended Family Breakthrough Podcast. We're your hosts, Mike and Kim.
We believe in a world where blended families can experience a future full of hope, connection, and peace.
That's why we offer tools, strategies, and guidance that move you from a place of confusion and conflict to experiencing a life of confidence and connection.
We're so glad you're joining us for authentic and sometimes comical conversations as we cover everything from romance to parenting and yes, even dealing with that difficult ex.
So if you're ready to experience breakthrough in your blended family, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. Well, hey, Krista, thanks so much for being here. We are really excited to dive into this conversation with you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. We're excited.
Well, thank you. And as we said before we hit record, literally, I don't think we can have enough grief conversations. So when people like you want to talk about it, I'm excited. Sounds strange to say excited about grief in the same sentence, but I am.
Yes. Well, it's great. You've got a mission to really help people process this whole thing of grief. I wonder, before we dive into all that, would you be willing to share just a little bit of your personal story?
Yeah, absolutely. This working with people in the grief space was never part of the master plan of my life. So I found myself at 40. I had divorced. I'd been married, had 2 kids. Marriage did not end well. Tried like crazy, but ultimately decided to get divorced. And then I remarried, and the remarriage felt like just kind of proof that you could have what you wanted in a relationship, and you could have the person who would just see you the way you wanted to be seen and treat you the way you wanted to be treated. And so I felt like life was just on this real high for me at that point. And he and I had taken a trip, and we were on our way back from that trip. We'd driven separately, and I had a flat tire. We were so close to being home, but I had a flat tire, pulled over on the side of the interstate. He pulled over behind me. And even though we had AAA, he was stubborn. I don't want to wait on AAA. Let me just change the tire myself. I just want to get home. So he's standing in between the two cars, trying to get the spare tire out of the trunk of my car, my Camry. And I am on the side of the road texting my daughter, who's 12 at the time. I also had a son who's 9. And I'm texting her, and a driver who we later found out had meth and alcohol in his system. It's 5:30 on a Sunday. It is daylight. Our hazard lights are on, but that driver did not see us and just crashed right in the back of Hugo's Durango and trapped him in between his car and mine. And so I went from a real high to the lowest low that I could imagine. And real quick, I figured out that what I thought I knew about grief was not helping me. Even though I had a great therapist, I had outdated information about grief. I did not have tools to help me. And so fast forward quite a bit, when I had really gone through it and figured it out and gotten back to functioning, I decided I don't want people to go through this. I want them to be better prepared for this, and ultimately switched careers and became a coach. And now I specifically work with widowed moms and host a podcast, specifically, the Widowed Mom podcast, for this purpose.
Yes.
And it's what I do now. So I didn't see it coming. It really wasn't something I ever thought I would do, but it is the most rewarding work I can imagine doing.
That's amazing.
Wow.
What an amazing story. I want to center on just one little thing I heard in there, which is actually a really big thing, is you went through a divorce and then a remarriage. And in your remarriage, what you were experiencing to that point was great. I mean, it was positive. There was a connection with Hugo and those kinds of things. And then in a moment, all of that changed so unexpectedly.
Yep. Just completely and surprisingly gone. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Wow. And not only that, but it sounds like Hugo was a good step parent to your kids as well.
Was.
Yeah.
He was such a good step parent, and a good parent himself. So he and his wife didn't have a child biologically together, but she was pregnant. And when she was pregnant, actually Lance's dad left her while pregnant, stole all of her stuff. It's quite the story. And so Hugo was the only dad Lance ever had. They met when Lance was in diapers, and he was a teenager by the time he came into my life, but he was a wonderful dad to Lance. And he was a wonderful dad to my kids. Interesting to watch both of my kids, all three of them really, but interesting to watch them process it all so differently.
Yes.
Wow.
Such a great example of how we can have, the same person die and all have a completely different experience of that loss.
Right. Yeah. And grief in a very unique way.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. That's such a great segue into one of my pet peeves, right? Is that we tend to think that grief is supposed to be somehow formulaic or prescriptive or similar. Right. And that we can say, okay, well, we all lost this person. Yes. And every single person will have an experience of coming to terms with that loss that is as unique as their relationship was. Right. It's more like it's never formulaic. It's more like a fingerprint where it's completely unique to the individual. And so it's totally normal that we would all have a different experience losing the same person or the same situation, right? Maybe what we lost wasn't that someone died. Maybe we lost the way that we thought of our family through divorce, right? Which my kids had also been through.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. One thing we say a lot is that every blended family is born out of loss.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There was a previous loss, whether it was a death of a parent, a divorce, some kind of separation, abandonment. We're coming into our blend, grieving some type of loss.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's true. But at what point in your journey did you kind of figure out this doesn't fit into a formula for me or for my kids? Like, how long did you struggle with trying to live out, some of these formulas, ideas? Yeah. I mean, there are common ideas around those 5 stages of grief.
Yeah, pretty quickly, to be honest, because the 5 stages of grief was the only grief theory that I was familiar with. And I didn't know it enough to be able to quote it to you or anything, but that was one of the first books I went and bought because I was thinking, okay, I know there are 5 stages and I need to figure out what they are because I'm going to get the A.
Yeah.
We're going to get the A in grief, and we're going to help our kids get the A, as though there is such a thing, right?
Yeah.
So, what I quickly learned, and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who created the 5 stages, wrote this later in life, that even she never intended for us to use her work the way that a lot of us had used it, right? Her work was done in 1969. It was originally a study of terminally ill patients. It was anecdotal, and it was based on what was happening to people who were coming to grips with their own terminal diagnosis. It wasn't about bereavement, right? Losing a person. It was about them coming face to face with their own loss. And so anecdotally, she was noticing, a lot of them, go through this denial experience, and then they get angry, and then they bargain, and then they get depressed, and then ultimately they accept their diagnosis. And so she wrote this book called On Death and Dying. It was about that. And then later, she and David Kessler wrote a book called On Grief and Grieving, where they took the 5 stages and applied it to grief and grieving. But even then, she never really intended for us to take it and make it a formula or a prescription, or to insinuate that we would only experience it in that way, right? So it was a relief to read that, her work later in life, that it wasn't some box you were supposed to try to fit yourself into, and that it really could be unique and different. And you don't have to be angry. There's not a particular amount of anger that you're supposed to feel, and that everybody really does experience it differently.
Yeah. So if I'm a parent, and not only am I dealing with my own grief, but I'm helping my kids go through it, I'm not supposed to be like watching for, okay, we're about halfway through denial now. And just another month and we're going to be in great shape getting past that stage and check the box. That's not how I do it.
That fortunately you do not have to do that. I mean, fortunately or unfortunately, I guess I kind of understand that as parents, and really as individuals experiencing grief, that we wish it could be formulaic to some extent. We would so love an instruction manual that just said, do this, do that, watch for this, watch for that. So I get that even that may not sound like great news. Right. If you really do want the black and white. But it really just isn't that. I like to just zoom out and think about, first of all, defining grief, right? If the definition that is my favorite is that it's the natural human response to a perceived loss. And I love that definition. One, it's so generous, because grief isn't just losing a person who died, right? That's bereavement. Grief is our natural response to something that we perceive as a loss, which gives room for so much individualism.
Yes.
And says, okay, this may not have felt like a loss to you, but that doesn't mean it doesn't feel like a loss to someone else.
Yeah.
Right.
I love that word, perceived.
Yeah.
It is going to be different.
And it also opens the doorway to what I think is really helpful to understand, which is that there is no end to grief. If we're always going to have the loss, which we are, because we can't time travel, right? The loss is always going to be there, and we're always going to have a response to it. Yes, that response can change over time, and it will, but also it's always going to be part of our life experience. And I find that in a way that there's great relief in that, because now there's nothing that we're trying to reach. Right. There's no place called acceptance that once we get there, we're done. It's really, we're looking for, how do I integrate what has happened? How do I go from, my automatic and sometimes very challenging thoughts about what has happened to really thinking about what I want to make this mean in my world. And then that also, helps prepare for secondary losses, which are such a huge part of grief too. And I wish I had known those things after Hugo died earlier.
Yeah. Wow. So what I hear you saying is that grief really is part of our present, part of our future. What we've noticed about grief is that it ebbs and flows.
Sure.
Sometimes it feels different, and then it will kind of dissipate a bit for a season. And then those memories come up and we relive it. And so it's not something that, okay, we're one and done with, we're through that. It's continually coming to the surface. And we see that with children of divorce. They will navigate through the loss and the grief, and they'll get to a new place of normal, whether their parent has, remarried or not. And then something comes up,
Mm.
graduation, or they go to a friend's house and their friends' parents are a first family home, and they see that and they remember what that was like, or they miss that, or they wonder, where would we have been if my parents had stayed together? And then so the grief bubbles back up to the surface and they're hurting again. And so I think parents really need to understand that this is going to be ongoing dialogue with children as they work through these things.
Yeah. And all the things you just described are secondary losses.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you're talking about divorce, the divorce is the primary loss. And then any loss that happens, the knock-on losses are secondary losses, which means it can be real easy to see that happen either with yourself or with your child and then say, oh, well, they must not be, dealing with it. Okay. Or maybe we missed something, or I should have taken them to more therapy, or, they're sliding backwards. Right. And we give natural responses to secondary losses, these unhelpful labels and meanings. Right. And then we have we miss the opportunity to normalize what is very normal.
Yes. Yes. Love that.
I love that. There's, one blended family expert named Ron Deal, and he equates all of that to earthquakes. And we have this initial earthquake and it disrupts everything. And then later, as we move along, there's these aftershocks, and those aftershocks can be just as scary and they can be just as traumatic as the initial quake. And I hear you calling those kind of those secondary losses that come along with all that. It's a very similar thought. It's interesting to me, before we hopped on, and even as we had some email exchange, there was a piece in there talking about trauma, because trauma is a part, that's where often our grief comes from, right? And you have a little term in there called post-traumatic growth. So I wonder, could we spend a little bit of time just talking about, okay, what is trauma really? How do we move forward from trauma? And what is this idea about post-traumatic growth?
I also love when anybody wants to talk about post-traumatic growth, because I don't think a lot of people know about it. And I remember the first time I heard about it, and I just felt like it was one of those record scratch moments where you're like, wait, what did they say? What?
Right.
Because we're also familiar with the idea of post-traumatic stress disorder, but post-traumatic growth, not so much. So post-traumatic growth is actually a term that's been around since the mid-90s. I didn't know about it in the mid-90s, clearly. But it was created by a couple of researchers, last names Tedeschi and Calhoun. And prior to their work, and at that time, we were using a definition of trauma that was very much objective as opposed to subjective. So we kind of had this list of things that people typically thought of as traumatic events. And, this was the list. And then later there was this, okay, now we'll call it, the big T list, and then we'll call it the little T list, right? Oh. And now we don't really use those terms so much because we know that trauma is so subjective. Again, it's just much like grief, in that what might be traumatic to me might not be traumatic to another person, but that doesn't make my trauma any less valid, or any less traumatic for me. So anyway, all that to say, it is very much an objective or a subjective experience. What these two researchers were noticing at the time that they were doing their work in the mid-90s was that prior to a quote unquote traumatic event, there would be a level of wellness or life satisfaction that someone was experiencing. And at the time, it was thought that following that traumatic event, the best we could hope for is to get them back to that level of wellness or quality of life. Like that was the goal, right? So we would expect them to bounce down, and then the goal was to get them to bounce back up. And what they were noticing is kind of three different responses. One response was that some people would bounce down and then never come back up.
Never recover.
Never recover, essentially. Another group would bounce down, but then bounce back and recover. But then they started noticing that the third group that would bounce down, but then not just bounce back, they would bounce forward. They would bounce up. Wow. They were reporting greater levels of wellness and life satisfaction. Wow. And it wasn't in spite of the trauma, quote unquote, you see my air quotes, it was because of it.
Right.
Right. It was because of what they had decided to do after that traumatic event had happened.
Mm.
Not that we want to think of post-traumatic growth as the goal, right? The last thing we need is another should or another expectation.
Right.
But I think it's really refreshing to know that there's nothing that can happen to us in life that we don't get to decide how we want to think about or respond to.
Mm-hmm.
And that's essentially what post-traumatic growth says, is it can be a great, and this is what it was for me, a great wake-up call, right? Because I know I was going through life. I mean, I was very happy to be in that marriage. And so I felt a greater sense of appreciation than I probably had in a long time. And still, I was going through the motions of adulting, of midlife adulting, right? You go to work, you pay the bills, you feed the kids, you do the things, and you're not really, or at least I wasn't, stopping to consider, what is the quality of my life like? Am I happy with my spiritual life? Am I happy with the quality of my relationships, right? Am I just going through the motions, or am I really living in a way that is aligned with my values? And post-traumatic growth says, oh, we can stop and we can check in and we can make adjustments accordingly. And those might be big adjustments, like for me, a career change, huge adjustment, right? That's a big change.
Yeah.
But it can also just be very small things of, oh, I noticed that I'm carrying these old friendships around with me simply because we knew each other growing up, right? But maybe I don't want those relationships in my life. Maybe that's not where I want to be spending my time. Or maybe I'm not showing up as my most authentic self in places where that matters to me. Right. And so I can do that. So we can really go through and kind of inventory life and look at what matters and then make adjustments so that we are living even more aligned with what we value than we were before that traumatic experience happened.
Hey there, thanks for listening to the conversation with Krista so far. We just wanted to give you a quick heads up that from this point in our conversation, we had an unexplained glitch with our sound. Now, Krista still sounds great, but you may hear some static occasionally when Kim and I speak. We apologize for that and just simply ask for you to hang in there and listen through to the end, as this was such a valuable conversation with Krista. So thanks for your grace on that, and let's get back to the discussion. It sort of makes me think about my own story. You know, I've shared on our show several times that I lost my mother when I was only a year old. Got really close with my grandparents at that time. And then when my dad remarried, I had to leave their home, which was another form of trauma, I suppose you could say, just that separation from Nana and Papa. I was on my own at 16 years old and those kinds of things. And then fast forward, and you know, we went through a 3-year court battle with Kim's ex, and it was really ugly,
traumatic
really
for me.
difficult, and all of that to then be leading, you know, just a handful of years ago to how do we now come alongside other couples and help them deal with some of that and move forward. One of the things that I'm curious about from your perspective, as I just share little snippets of my story, you know, there's struggle in there. And I think, I don't know, Kim might disagree with me, but I think maybe I've experienced some post-traumatic growth in my years, but I don't think I've done that intentionally. And I wonder, like, how do you take that, even maybe it's somebody of my stage of life, and begin to just actually make it a part of your experience for my own good and for the good of the people that are around me? Like, what do I actually do with that now that I'm aware this is even a thing?
Yeah, I think a lot of people have probably experienced post-traumatic growth, right? It really just is, another way of saying it is positive psychological change. Right? Following something that they experienced as traumatic. So a lot of people are probably walking around and just haven't had a name for it, but they've already created it. And also, I don't think we have to wait until we have something that we experience as traumatic to create a positive psychological change,
exactly.
right? Sure, that's probably advisable and something we would all like on a regular basis. And the domains that these two researchers talked about were personal relationships, like interpersonal relationships, right? That we could experience positive psychological change in terms of new possibilities, right? Which is very broad.
Yeah.
Personal strength, spiritual change, and appreciation of life. And so really, to me, first, an activity of getting back in touch with what you value, what matters to you.
Yes.
Right. And then looking at those areas of life and just being honest.
Right.
I would share that you have gone through that as you came out of battling cancer.
Oh, that's true.
Which is one of the reasons.
Well.
Yeah. I remember when I first met Mike, he had just come through, chemo, radiation, all of it. And he had shaved his head because he lost his hair. And then he continues to shave his head.
Yeah, that's why my hair's gone.
As a reminder of that appreciation, how fragile life is.
Absolutely.
And there was spiritual and relational and strength. I mean, all of those things you just mentioned, you definitely experienced through that trauma.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, thanks for observing that. So how does somebody do that intentionally, Krista?
Yeah. Here's what I don't want people to hear when I talk about it. I really don't want anybody to hear that it's something else we're supposed to do.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I think it's a beautiful thing that actually happens very often in an organic way, and that we don't need to force. When we turn it into a should, it just adds pressure, and there's already so much of that. So I don't want people to hear that. But it is, I think, a great practice to either for ourselves and with our children to really consider, what do I value? Right? Can I just go through a simple exercise? And there's so many different ways to do it, right? You can just, if you want, just Google list of values and print them off and, circle what feels like your top 5. Have conversations with your spouse about what you value, right? Have conversations with your kids about what they value. How do we deal with situations when we notice we value truth, but we're inclined to tell a lie, right? Those things, those are the conversations that give us the opportunity to live more in alignment with what it is that we say we want. And sometimes we just don't stop long enough to have those conversations, right? We don't think about what we value. Or when it comes to children and sometimes ourselves, we're missing opportunities to help facilitate courage and bravery, which is what is often required of us to take steps that have us living more of what we value.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. It really helps to teach perseverance and grit and strength building.
Yeah.
Another thing that might make it really difficult for parents to have these types of conversations with their kids is because if they're feeling fear or guilt or their own grief that they haven't fully processed through, it's hard to come alongside your child who's hurting and grieving and navigating loss without that getting triggered in you. And what we sometimes notice, and I know I did this early on, is I kind of felt like after we came through the divorce and I knew, my child had hit an earthquake, that was an earthquake. But even on the other side, I kind of felt like I needed to protect her from any further harm and kind of bubble wrap her life. And, I don't want to make anything tough for her and everything needs to go well for her from here on out, which is so unrealistic. But at the time, that instinct to protect your child comes out and you don't want to see them go through any hurt, any grief. And then once they do, you feel like you have to really be vigilant. And that can lead to some non-productive parenting, such as just kind of leaning towards the permissiveness where I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to discipline or put healthy boundaries or limits in place because that might upset my child. And we see sometimes parents looking at their children through the lens of trauma and treating them with kind of this pity, this kind of, oh, my poor fragile child who's been through this awful thing. What would be your best advice to a parent as they're struggling through their own journey of grief and see their child also grieving? How can they manage that in a really healthy way that doesn't lead to any of the pitfalls that I kind of just talked about?
Yeah, I think a first step would be just knowing that we're going to screw it up. Because we are human. We are human, and
for sure.
Yeah, we're gonna do it in ways that we later wish we hadn't. And if we can just decide in advance that that's the way that it's probably going to be, and we're going to extend ourselves grace, I think that can be super helpful. Then I would suggest there is such value in curiosity as it relates to what we've been taught the point of life is in the first place. I think so many of us, myself included, have bought into the idea that the waters are supposed to be smooth, right? That happiness is the goal. And when that's the goal that we're pursuing or what we're expecting, it should be like, then of course it makes sense that we're going to try to minimize conflict and just, be permissive, especially when we've already perceived they've been through so much, like, so I'll just give them what they want. And I'll buy them the extra thing, and I won't keep the boundary or enforce the consequence, because we've decided that smooth sailing is the goal.
Right.
It's the way it's supposed to be. But if we can get curious about that, right? And the conclusion that I came to, but I want, other people to come to their own conclusions, is that I don't think that is the point. I don't think the point is for the waters to be smooth and for there to be, no conflict. And that I don't think happiness is the goal, right? I think the full spectrum of human emotion is supposed to be part of the experience. I think bad things are going to happen as humans, right? So instead of the goal being, can I get rid of all of the waves for my kids so there's never any waves? It's, how can I help them learn to surf the waves? How can I help them learn to anticipate the waves and adjust to the waves? Because though that is what it's like to be a human on this planet, my experience.
Absolutely.
If I am out there mowing the lawn in front of them, and trying to clear the path, that's not really preparing them for what it is like to be human. And so but also what that requires is discomfort, right? It requires me internally to find within myself a level of comfort with my own discomfort.
Yep.
Right. And a level of comfort with their discomfort.
Right.
And that's not something a lot of people are teaching. I bet you probably are. Right. You're probably helping. You're
we
right.
were just recording some
We just recorded an episode
Yeah.
on managing, tolerating discomfort and distress.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And if we're always like, oh, nope, distress equals must solve problem, must be permissive, must, then that's I think what makes that pattern so much easier to fall into.
Yeah.
Like, oh, wait, what if it actually is about increasing our ability to tolerate discomfort, increasing our ability to, feel powerless and make peace with that. And some of those things that go against be happy.
Yeah.
Consumerism.
Absolutely. So, Krista, once we rewrite that story and say, okay, wait, that's not the goal, but the goal actually is to learn to surf the waves. I love the way that you put that.
We actually have a plaque. I actually made a plaque that says you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
I saw it in a surf shop in Oregon, of the Oregon coast, and I'm like, I love that. So I recreated it.
Absolutely true. So, Krista, once we're able to rewrite that story, what is it that you've learned in your own experience that might help other people support their children through their own grief and their own bereavement?
I remember pretty early on in grief that there were some people who didn't seem to have the ability to be with me and how I was honestly feeling. And so they would try to pep me up, they were the people, and everybody seemed to have a different approach to that. But some people would try to pep you up. Some people would try to change the subject. Some people would be very avoidant in terms of what they were willing to talk about. Some people would want you to count your blessings or try to help you count your blessings. And then there were other people who I felt most comfortable around who never did that. Right? They were just with me in it. And they never tried to make me feel better. And they were just great at witnessing and being with me. And to me, that is a huge part of how we support ourselves in grief, for sure. Is we don't make ourselves wrong for how we feel. We don't try to talk ourselves out of how we feel. We just figure out how we can kind of witness our own experience. But I think we can also do that with our children. It doesn't feel good when somebody tries to talk you out of sadness that you're feeling or whatever you're feeling. It doesn't feel good. It feels better when someone is there with you in it. And a lot of us are parenting in ways that we don't really mean to. It's not, it doesn't come from a bad place, but we're essentially sending the message to our kids that, hey, how you feel isn't quite right. And I'm going to try to help you get out of it.
Yeah. And that leaves our children feeling very alone in their grief. Like they don't have anywhere to go with it. And so then they kind of just stuff it down or find other ways to try and survive that aren't always the best ways.
Yeah.
I mean, I love that we're not trying to do the whole, hey, you also need to do this. Let's add to your whole menagerie of things you need to be doing as a parent. But this piece you talked about earlier of just getting curious. So instead of deflecting, or putting on the silver lining, which a lot of parents will do, try to refocus their kids on positive things, or, hey, let's go get an ice cream and, deflect the sadness. Just getting curious. Hey, tell me more.
What's it like? Yeah. What's it like for you? It's that scene, Inside Out.
Yeah.
I love me some Pixar, but that scene, what I'm talking about in Inside Out, with where Sadness and Bing Bong are having the conversation. It's so Bing Bong has just the imaginary rocket that he takes Riley on trips with has just gotten thrown into the dump, and he sits there and he's about to cry. Bing Bong is Riley's imaginary friend, and Joy comes up and she tries to tickle him and she tries to make jokes and she basically tries to talk him out of feeling sad. And then Sadness comes up and she sits down and she's just like, oh, it must be so sad. And she does what you exactly just said, right? Which is she's just with him and curious and not trying to change it. And then he cries his candy tears.
And that's what he needed to do.
Yeah. And that's what he needed. And it's, that wouldn't be possible if we thought that how the child was feeling was a problem to solve. That is only possible when we think that the experience the child is having, right? The emotion is just an experience to allow. And then we can get curious about it.
Yeah.
And be the witness.
So good. So good, Krista. I'm wondering what might be 2 or 3 things that you would encourage parents to do from a practical standpoint in order to sit in the grief or sit in the challenge with their child?
Most of the parents that I work with were not taught how to feel emotions. And so it's not a skill that they can really give their kids because they weren't taught that themselves. And so I think one of the best things we can do is to go learn some skills for us. Like, how do we process emotions? There's so many different ways to do it, but not just how do we think about our feelings, but how do we actually come back to our body and let those feelings flow through? What are the ways that work well for us? And then when we've experimented with it, then we can role model it or offer options to our kids for how they can do it themselves. Again, not insinuating that the emotion is a problem, but because if we just can't offer what we don't know. So I think that can be very useful, and open conversation about the emotions that you are experiencing can also be very helpful. If you are always hiding your emotional experiences from your child, they are receiving the message that you're supposed to have emotions by yourself. And so it doesn't have to be wild. It's not like I'm saying, tsunami crying in front of your child, but normalizing that, hey, this is how I'm feeling. My little guy, I say little guy, he's about to turn 17. I know, right? I so remember conversations with him when he was little and after Hugo died too, where he would say things like, Mommy, are you sad? I want to make you happy. And so many times I would say something like, buddy, it's okay that Mommy's sad. And it's not something that you can fix, right? Mommy's job is to take care of Mommy and your job is to take care of you. And it's not a problem that I'm sad. And also it's not something you can change. Sure. And just continuing to remind him that my emotions were not his responsibility.
Yes. I love that.
And now my daughter never took that on. Right. So every kid is different.
Yeah,
he
for sure
did.
But isn't it funny how he was experiencing discomfort with your discomfort? Like even our kids can pick up on our cues and they want to jump in and fix it. Some kids based on their wiring. And so isn't it interesting how we're each experiencing, sadness through the same things we've been through it different, in different ways. And we're each cued into each other's emotions and wanting to help. And one of the best ways is to just talk.
For sure.
process, allow that safe space to process through it. But I love your response there to your little guy. That's so awesome.
Or not so little guy.
Yeah, not so little guy.
So little.
Our littlest guy's about to turn 20.
Yes,
So we
we understand.
Yeah.
It's shocking.
You said something in there I thought was really distinct, because we work with lots of different couples and we hear lots of people talk about how, kind of growing up in that place where we didn't process our emotions well in my family of origin. And a lot of the stories that I hear coming out of that are stuck in people's heads are that emotions aren't okay. Like we hear that story, but you said it a little differently a moment ago. You said that, you're supposed to have emotions by yourself. Not that they're not okay, but when it comes to tough emotions, like the story that gets built in people's minds, you're on your own and they're supposed to be private. You don't put them out there for other people. And I think that's a really distinct difference between what I sometimes hear. And I wonder, it feels like maybe sometimes say, emotions aren't okay, but this might be actually closer to accurate of what they're actually experiencing, because we can't not experience emotions.
Yeah. That is the human experience after all.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know if there's a question in there, but it was just like, when you said that, I thought, oh, wow, like that's something I need to process for myself as well. Not only as I, try to be a good husband to Kim, but as I think about all of our adult children as well, and how do I just come alongside them and help them to know that emotions don't have to be a completely private thing. In fact, I believe that we were created for community, and part of community is this blessing of being able to process these hard things together.
I agree. Yeah. And I think there's so much value too in each parent looking at, if they want to, looking at what did I learn about emotions, right? And it might be very different based on your family, based on if you were socialized as a woman or a man, right? Because we have all picked up some very explicit messages around emotions, some much more, implicit and implied. Yeah. And when we can start to see, every time I got sad, my dad told me to go to my room, right? If you're going to cry, go to your room, right? If you want to cry, I'll give you something to cry about. Like we were taught these things. And so when we can get curious about the rules that we're carrying around that we didn't even really mean to pick up, then we can challenge them. Yeah. And then we can decide, like, is this what I want to role model to my kids? Maybe not.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think from a parenting and step parenting perspective, what we often focus on is the behavior. We see a mopey kid or a kid stomping or slamming the door or, not engaging in the conversation, not being bright and bubbly and polite. And we focus on that behavior and we want to correct that behavior. It's not okay for you to stomp around the house. It's not okay for you to act that way, when what's really going on is there's some emotions underneath that behavior. So rather than jumping just to the behavior, how can we stop and go, I wonder what's going on for that kiddo. What are the fears they might be experiencing? What is the loss they might be feeling? And not just hyper focus on behavior, because we can definitely talk about the behavior later, but it's so much better when you can help the child understand what's going on under the behavior to then talk about correcting the behavior. If you jump straight to behavior correction, this isn't okay, then we're sending that message that what's happening under the surface isn't all right. I don't want to see it.
Right.
And that really can shut the kids down.
So I know somebody's listening and they're saying, okay, well, not every behavior is connected to some previous grief or trauma or whatever. So how does somebody know if this is just normal, typical child behavior, or if this is something that, that's connected to trauma or grief? How do we even know that?
Yeah, I love that question because it comes up so much. You're right.
I bet.
Is this normal childhood behavior or is this grief or trauma? And my answer to that is maybe not what people want to hear, but my answer is that it's just not a relevant question. It's not a useful question because there really is no difference, right? Once someone has experienced grief or some sort of trauma, right, that becomes part of the lens through which they see the world. there's no way to parse them apart, right? And it's just not relevant. It is, okay, this is, now what? Right? It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Can't take them apart. And it really doesn't, even if we could take them apart and identify normal versus grief related, where does that take us?
Yeah.
It doesn't take us toward a solution.
No.
Right.
No.
So you're saying that's just a false question altogether.
Yeah, there's just no value in it, because so what? Like if you play it out and you answer, okay, well, that's grief related. Okay, well, then what?
Yeah. So I guess it's fine for them to stomp their feet and throw a giant, throw things around the store because it's trauma or grief related.
Yeah. No.
Yeah. To me, that question is like, we don't mean to be in a place of resistance, but that's usually where we are when we're asking it. We are in our mind thinking this shouldn't be happening. So I'm going to try to figure out why it's happening. Is it grief? Is it trauma? Is it normal childhood behavior? It's definitely, I've labeled it as a problem. I've decided it shouldn't be happening. And so now I'm going to go searching for a root cause. Yeah. It's happening.
Yeah.
Right.
This is what it is.
Yeah.
Right.
A lot of the behavior that gets labeled in blended families is, that child is manipulating you. They're being manipulative. We need to get on that. And it's like, yeah, they might be, but it's because they have a need that hasn't been met. Adults are manipulative too when their needs aren't being met. We all figure out ways to get our needs met. It's just not helpful to label a child. Yeah. It's so much better if you can say, yeah, you're right. That's a behavior I see. But how can we, again, get back to the values? How can we come alongside kids and talk about those root values that we want for them as they grow into adults, and at the same time help them manage this loss and this grief that will always be there, because we really cannot fully understand the present without tying it to the past.
And these types of things that we go through really do impact everything, right? There's nothing that goes untouched.
Right.
And so it's just not useful to keep trying to find the places where there's some sort of separation, because really it's so much more pervasive than that. Doesn't add much value as I see it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love that we just call out that that's a false question. If there's behavior that needs to be dealt with, then let's talk about what it looks like to deal with the behavior without losing the ability to understand the fear or the struggle or the grief or the experience that's going on underneath.
Yeah. Which questions like what Kim said earlier about, really understanding where are they coming from, not just looking at the behavior, but what are they thinking and feeling that's driving that behavior? And then how do we help them from that angle? That's still such a curious and useful way to look at it without saying, well, it's because it's abnormal or it's.
And sometimes their feelings are always their feelings are absolutely valid. But if we take a minute and listen to what they're experiencing, sometimes it's like, oh yeah, okay, I understand. I get it. There's a story of a step parent. The stepchild comes home, transition time into their home. And she gently reminds him of, an expectation that's been set by the bio parent, a chore or whatever. And he just kind of flips out and gets really rude to her and stomps off and slams the door. And instead of reacting to his behavior and trying to correct it, she comes alongside him and gets curious and starts asking questions. And come to find out, he was feeling really annoyed because he had just come from bio mom's house having to do a set of chores. And now the minute he walks in this other house, now he's confronted, guess what? You get to do some more chores. Yeah. And he's irritated by that. And who wouldn't be? That's so understandable. Right. But he can't articulate that in the moment. It's going to come out in a little angry outburst. But if you can help the child and walk them through that and get some understanding and allow them to talk about their irritation, then later she came back around and said, hey, I'm glad we were able to talk. I understand this is hard. Let's figure out how we can make things better for you. And at the same time, it's not okay to talk to me that way. And he was fully accepting at that point because she'd allowed him to talk about what was happening under the surface. And I just love that story because we're so prone to just jumping on the behavior without really fully understanding what's happening. And again, that's a loss. I live in 2 homes. I have to move back and forth between 2 homes. It's not his fault that his parents are divorced. And it's irritating, to have to deal with this.
Yeah, I think sometimes related to this, maybe it's also related to what we were saying earlier about this idea that our focus is just on happiness. But I wonder, I might be the only one, and if I am, then let's just cut this out of the podcast. But if I might be the only one where there's times and there's relationships, and this it has happened in my fatherhood and in being a stepdad and all of that, where it's like, it's okay for me to have a bad day and for me to feel bad, but it's not okay for people around me to have the same. Like, they need to be happy and comply so that I don't have to deal with that. So I might be the only one that ever has that idea or thought in my head, but I wonder what's your response to that, Krista?
I'm going to throw myself in with your camp, whatever we're calling it.
I will as well.
No, for sure. Right. I mean, and I think we have to consider too, like, even just in terms of how we are wired to survive as humans, we have within us a value for other people around us to, be happy with us, right? Accept us for our survival. Right. At a certain point, not so much now, but that really did matter, right? If we got kicked out of the tribe, then we would die. It makes sense that we still prioritize the emotions of other people. And then also, there is an opportunity there of, okay, if I can't control other people and they aren't going to be happy all the time around me, then how do I create, an ability to be more comfortable when they are not happy, so that I don't need to solve, air quotes, the way that they feel. And that's hard work.
Yeah. It's not easy.
Other people are not a formula. That's right.
Yeah.
I'm not going to solve it. Yeah.
Wouldn't it be nice? Wouldn't it be nice if grief was a formula and other people were a formula, and we could just follow the formula?
I could really enjoy my world if that were all the case, right?
Yeah. Happy all the time.
That's right.
I mean, what it really boils down to is allowing everyone to be authentic with where they are. When we tell or send the message that it's not okay for you to be sad, or it's not okay for you to be angry in this house, or you need to go to your room, if you're sad, go to your room. What we're sending this message that you can't be authentic in front of me.
Yeah.
And we do that as adults too with each other. It's like you need to have a good attitude when you're around me, or I'm just going to shut you out, rather than getting curious and trying to understand what you're going through. And we want to create an atmosphere of, you can be authentic, you can be real. It's all right. I can handle it. I will be there for you, even when it's not pleasant and it's not fun for me. I can put my own stuff aside in order to be here for you. And one of the pieces of research, I think it's come from John Gottman, is that just helping any human being, a child, adult, anyone, just helping them identify the word that they're feeling, whatever it is they're feeling, just labeling the emotion can help to dissipate the tension and calm the nervous system by up to 60%. It's huge. Yeah. Just labeling it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's fascinating. And I think it's useful too. Sometimes then people will, when they hear that, they'll get a little fixated on, trying to find the exact precise word for the emotion that they're feeling. And I think it's valuable to know, yes, by all means, if you can give it a label, great. And also, if don't let the label hang you up, even if you're just like, it feels, and you can describe what it feels like for you in your body. It's like a bowling ball in my stomach. Okay. Same value, even if we don't have a super precise label.
That's great. Yeah. We can generalize it more, and it still helps us move forward. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Absolutely. Yes. That's great. Yeah. I'm curious. So Krista, earlier, Kim was talking a little bit about like how sometimes bio parents they look more through the lens of pity, or they're trying to make everything okay, bubble wrap their kids and that kind of thing. I came into our blend as a childless step parent, so I didn't have any kids prior to our marriage. Okay. And we meet lots of different people who maybe just don't have the same kind of life experience. They might not have a category for the type of trauma or grief that my new spouse or my stepchildren are coming through. And then we add on top of that, this is like the opposite perspective that Kim shared earlier. We often quote Heather Hetchler, who's a blended family expert as well. And she says, bio parents see their kids through the lens of love first. So that's kind of what Kim's talking about. I'm trying to protect my child.
Mm-hmm.
A step parent sees that same child through the lens of responsibility first, and the view can be very different. And so I wonder if you take a moment to think about that and you think, okay, what would Krista say to that step parent who is kind of focused on the behavior because there's some frustrating things happening and we need to teach this child how to be successful adults someday and all of these things, but we don't have a category for the grief part of what they've been experiencing. What do you say to a step parent who genuinely wants to love this child really well and has great intentions, but in a practical sense, they're just struggling to figure out how to help that child navigate forward?
And could I add to that question?
Sure.
What?
Now we're going to complicate it for you, Krista. Yeah.
Well, it goes along.
Okay.
What would you say to a step parent who is step parent to a child who has lost a bio parent to death, and the stepchild would like to talk about their deceased parent and wants to relive memories and do that in front of this new step parent, and this makes the step parent feel a little stuck on the outside, a little uncomfortable, a little like, well, if they were still here, then I wouldn't be here, a little like an odd displacement.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's such a gift that we can give people to talk about loved ones that they've lost. And there is no competition. I hear this phrase a lot. I feel like I'm competing with a ghost. There's no competition. You're not competing. And it's so validating when you're the person who's lost someone to have someone else ask you, typically, I don't want to say everybody feels this way, but most people I have worked with actually really like it when you bring up the person that they've lost, right? When it's okay in the family culture to share funny stories about them and to have their photographs around and to, keep up with their traditions. And so I would just really, yes, I get that it can be uncomfortable if you are the step parent coming into that. And also it's such a gift to the griever, to the family, and really ultimately even to yourself, because of what I think the net impact will be for you to allow for and encourage open conversation and memory telling. And yeah, so many people are they're worried usually. It's, they're doing so great and I don't want to bring it up. If I bring it up, it'll make it worse. Actually, it's super lonely when you're the one thinking and not believing that you have permission to share what you're thinking. And you can give that to those kids.
Yeah.
I love that thought. I love that thought.
I love that too.
I shared earlier that my mother passed away when I was a year old. And when my dad remarried, my dad and stepmom really took the erase us and replace approach. That we could not talk about my mom. We couldn't admit that she existed in a previous life. And it wasn't like, you don't talk about her. It was just, we just knew
it was implied.
We just knew it was off limits. And I believe that really created a wedge between my dad and me. And it certainly created a wedge between my stepmom and me. Yeah. And that's challenging. So I love that just honoring the history, honoring the importance of the relationship. And I was only a year old. I have no memory of my mom, but I still want to understand who she is. Even now in my present day, I still want to understand more about her and who she is. And we can't just extract that. We can't pull that away or erase that from a child.
And there was no one for you to go to ask.
Yeah, exactly.
Or talk to. Yeah,
right.
It's tough.
Yeah. So I'm curious, that I love that. Just, hey, talk about it, ask about it, honor. Oh, I bet your dad would have loved that. Oh, your mom would be so proud of you right now. Those kinds of simple comments, I'm guessing, can really make a difference in our child's experience and in our relationship.
I think they really, really do. And it doesn't have to be deep. Literally just little stories and funny things and sharing those small memories. I think there's so much value in that. My heart hurts that you didn't have that.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Crystal, I want to circle back over kind of to the original intent
I got us off track there. Sorry.
And that is when a step parent is seen, is genuinely seeing difficult behavior from a child, and maybe the parent is stuck in that permissive parent mode that Kim is talking about,
or feeling paralyzed. They just don't know what to do,
and we're struggling. What would you say to a step parent who probably needs to talk to their spouse as well as show up well for a child and figure out how are we going to put some boundaries in place? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think where I might look first is, back to the curiosity idea of what is making it so uncomfortable for me to want to be honest with my spouse about what I'm seeing. Am I feeling unsafe to do that? And if so, how can I create more safety for myself to be honest? Not that that's necessarily going to give the outcome that you hoped for, but I think that if we can at least figure out what the barrier is to having the honest conversation, then we can have the honest conversation. And without that, there's probably not a lot of hope.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's great. Yeah, if I'm bottling it up, or I'm not willing to actually open up and say, hey, this is a struggle that I'm having, then we're never going to find resolution, right?
Yeah, building a parenting partnership in a blended family is one of the most challenging things to do. And that's kind of what we're touching on here is how do we talk about these children that are struggling, that are coming out of their grief, their loss. And yes, we're starting anew. We're excited because this is our new chance of happily ever after. And we're excited to be blending. But the kids are sometimes way far behind where we're at emotionally, and still wishing that mom and dad would get back together, or that mom had never passed away and that we were still all a family. And they've lost their family identity. Some of them have lost their role in the family when a blend comes, because now I'm no longer the oldest or the youngest. Some of them perceive this loss of stability and security from their parent, because now what does this mean? With all these new people coming into the house, what does that mean in my relationship with my parent? Some of them have lost social belonging. They've had to move to a new school, a new neighborhood. They've lost touch with other family members or friends that they had before. So they're navigating all kinds of loss and ongoing grief, even just beyond the death, the divorce, the abandonment. They're still navigating all these things well into their blend. And sometimes the adults really just don't want to have to acknowledge all these things. They're just, hey, we're starting out, we're pushing forward, and it can be really difficult.
For sure.
I wonder what you would add to that.
Well, I can just tell you how grateful I was growing up. We didn't really talk about my backstory, but I grew up spending 1 week at one house and 1 week at the other house, back and forth. And it sounds strange when I say it, but my mom and dad essentially, they got divorced, and then my stepmom got divorced from her husband. And then they, over a long period of time, switched. So my step parents were at one point married to each other.
All right.
And I know it sounds strange, right? And they were actually, my mom and my stepmom were like best friends in high school.
Wow.
It's a long history. So my mom and stepdad married, my stepmom and dad married, and then my brother, who was my stepbrother, and I would go back and forth from one house to another, week to week. And I don't really remember much about life before this happened, because I was probably 5 or so when it did. But one of the things that they always did is they fostered really open communication, even when it was hard. And I'm so grateful that they did that. The switch day was on Sunday. They would sit down and they would have a little family meeting, and they would discuss what had happened with my brother and I that week, and just really open communication. And not to say that is the panacea, the magic pill. It is not. But what a gift when we can be willing to set that time aside and prioritize open communication and see what's going on that week that we might want to know about, or whatever your arrangement is. When you said that, it just reminded me of how grateful I am.
Yeah, that's the ideal.
Yeah, what a great story, Krista. One thing that I know I'm going to walk away with today, particularly when I'm talking to parents and step parents who are struggling with this behavior, or struggling with things that they see going on, they just don't know how to respond to it. I love what you said early in our conversation, that grief is natural human response to a perceived loss.
Yes.
Like that really stood out to me. And when we can recognize that, hey, guess what? This is normal. Like, or it's okay that we're all normal. And let's walk through this in sometimes messy ways, but do it in a way that's uniting, and that I can just be with my child, be with those around me who are experiencing that challenge. I wonder, as we bring the conversation to a close, if you could just give one piece of advice to a parent or a step-parent who's listening right now, who maybe is either navigating their own grief or helping others around them navigate theirs, what would that one piece of advice be?
I think what I would love for people to take away is just this simple idea, simple conceptually, maybe not so easy to practice, but that emotions are not problems to solve. They really just are experiences to allow. And if we could make that switch internally with our own emotions, right? And then as we are parenting, co-parenting, watching what's happening with our children, and we just stopped trying to solve emotions, life would get so much easier. That one simple switch.
I love that.
That's amazing.
So powerful. Thank you so much. Krista, share a little bit before we wrap up about your podcast and your coaching services, and where can we find you? Because I'm sure somebody's listening going, I need to connect with Krista. So tell us about how we can do that.
Yeah. Well, I love podcasting too. And I have a podcast called the Widowed Mom Podcast. So for sure, anyone who's interested in grief or post-traumatic growth or knows a widow, you're welcome to listen. Please. I love it when people, share the podcast with their friends. Specifically, the work that I love doing is helping widows through what I call the grief plateau, which is kind of that place where they look like they're doing fine. People are telling them they're doing fine and they're strong and they're great, but they don't feel great. Right. And they're kind of tempted to resign for something that is less than what they want. I really love working with widows in that place so that we can go on and create, even more of what they want, right? The post-traumatic growth, that's what they want. And so that's what I do. And coachingwithkrista.com is where all of the socials can be found, and the podcast is there as well.
Yeah, we'll put links to those in the show notes, so it's easy to find.
Scroll down, click the link, and you'll find Krista.
Yes.
Awesome.
So it's an amazing conversation. We're so grateful for you for sharing and all that you've learned. What an amazing story you have. It's going to really bless our listeners. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Again, and I get more out of it probably than my clients do, right? I think you probably feel the same, right? That we come to this because of life experience, but then it's the work that keeps giving to us. And so, thanks for letting me come and talk about it.
Krista, thanks so much. We really appreciate your time and your wisdom.
Yes.
And we know that our listeners really just got some great value.
Oh, thank you.
Wow, that was an amazing conversation. I'm so excited that we had Krista on the show. I love that last little bit there of advice that emotions aren't problems to be solved. They're experiences to allow.
Yeah, that's super powerful.
So powerful.
I needed to hear that as a chronic fixer.
Yeah.
I'm always trying to fix stuff. And just that point of, sometimes we need to sit in it with that other person. And that includes our kids, and it includes each other as well.
Yeah. And if you, are kind of new to that concept and you're wondering, well, what does that look like? Or how do I do that? How do I, especially with my kids, come alongside and allow them to have this experience of grief? We're going to go ahead and put a link in the show notes to an episode that's all about emotion coaching, which is a skill any parent can learn to walk their kids through loss and grief in a really healthy way. Yeah. And, sometimes I think once we come out of these really tough seasons of loss and grief, we tend to have this approach of, we can carry on. We'll just pull ourselves up by the bootstraps and carry on, or we're just going to move on and kind of put that in the rearview mirror and not have to deal with it anymore. And those approaches really aren't what help. What we really want to do is kind of take it on. We want to take this journey of grief on when we need to. Not that we're going to dwell in it or get stuck in it, but we don't have to be afraid to take it on and work through it ourselves and with our children as well.
Yeah, that is a great point, honey. I just love the way you said that. What a blessing it was to have Krista join us on the show today. I'm confident that it brought some value to you. And if you want to connect with Krista, we encourage you to go click those links in the show notes. If you need some help with your blend, we encourage you to also click the link to set up a free coaching call with us. We would love to connect with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
But for now, we're going to make this episode a wrap.
Until next time.
Does it ever feel like people just don't get how tough it is to blend a family? What if you could experience a community that's all about healthy support, guidance, and practical strategies that help you thrive in your blended family? Well, now you can. Blending Together is a supportive community for blended family couples just like you.
We've educated and supported hundreds of couples navigating the unique challenges of blended family life. Now we're inviting you to join our community and experience the transformation that awaits you. Blending Together is not just another community. It's a place where you'll find practical, real-life strategies for building unity as a couple,
creating more connection as a family,
experiencing partnership in parenting,
and even dealing with that difficult ex.
Blending Together is a safe, growth-focused space where you'll get to connect with us and maybe more importantly, with other blended family couples who truly understand what you're going through. Along the way, you'll discover practical tools, guidance, and hope that empower you to find a future full of confidence and connection.
When you join Blending Together, you'll gain access to a variety of resources like our private Facebook group and online learning platform, monthly coaching meetings, monthly Q&As, and you'll even get to vote on the content for our monthly workshops.
Blending a family can often leave couples feeling alone or isolated, and quality support can sometimes be expensive and hard to find. That's why we're offering you access to all of this at a super low monthly rate, because every blended family deserves the opportunity to thrive regardless of their budget.
So scroll all the way to the bottom of the show notes and click the link to join us in the Blending Together community and meet other couples just like you in our upcoming community meeting. Plus, when you join before the end of the month, you'll gain access to our brand new bonus mini course that will help you make quick headway. Hey, thanks so much for joining us today. We can't wait to meet you inside Blending Together. Just click the link all the way at the bottom of the show notes to get started.
We'll see you there.